Oh, I think we're live.
Da, 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 da.
Great. Okay, well, hello to all of you who are watching, and welcome to the Global Media and Policy Seminar Series. This is an online seminar series jointly organized by the University of Oxford Program in Comparative Media Law and Policy. Important to turn off my own speakers, and also the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. So it's a partnership between Oxford and Joburg. And the series generally features insights on pressing issues affecting new media and human rights, particularly at the margins. So right now we are doing a special series on rights to the network in the lead up to the 2019 Internet Governance Forum, which will be happening in November. And so the idea for this series kind of grew out of some discussions that we had around this year's output from the Dynamic Coalition on Community Connectivity. And I will put the link to that Dynamic Coalition in the description of the video after we air. Dynamic coalitions are open multi-stakeholder groups dedicated to an internet governance issue, a specific one. And this one obviously is dedicated to issues related to community networks as a solution to sustainable internet access. So this year's outcome for that dynamic coalition will be presented at IGF, and it will focus on recommendations to regulators about how to better support and enable community networks. And so this whole series is themed around different issues in order to collect some useful insights and resources to inform that policy recommendations. So that's where the idea for this Rights to the Network series came from. So today we are starting with the first installment in that series on Rights to the Network, and I'm here with Steve Song, who will be discussing access to infrastructure as a key policy issue that's relevant to all of us, but certainly to enabling community networks. Steve is a part-time fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, which is where we are right now. And he's a research associate at the Network Startup Resource Center. He founded Village Telco, which is a social enterprise that manufactures low-cost Wi-Fi mesh VoIP technologies. He also works with the Association for Progressive Communications, and in the past, he was a Shuttleworth Fellow. Steve's work focuses on affordable access to communications infrastructure, and he has a really great blog on those issues at manypossibilities.net, and I will also link to that in the video description after we air. So before we get going, just a quick technical note, which is that it's just me and Steve here for this broadcast. So I will be monitoring the comments as we go, and I'll also be checking Twitter to see if you send us any questions on there. And you can do that by using the hashtag #GlobalMediaQ, that's the letter Q. And so if I look a little distracted, like I'm on the screen or I'm looking at my phone, I promise it's not because I don't find our conversation interesting. I'm just checking up on our comments and questions that are coming through. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Brilliant. So to get started, I thought maybe we could just begin with you introducing a little bit of how you got into this particular area of interest. So how did you start working on community networking? How did you get interested in telecoms infrastructure?
Well, it goes back quite a long way, actually, to 1990 and moving to South Africa and getting involved with an APC organization called Sangonet and helping them set up their first internet services and realizing just how the transformative potential of internet to change the dynamics of and really give a voice to people who otherwise wouldn't have that, and seeing that potential and wondering how it might spread across the continent is kind of a left turn in my life from which I have not turned back.
Yeah, and here we are.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, to frame this discussion then around infrastructure, about why we're talking about this in the course of this series on rights to the network. So about 50% of the world is online right now, which means there's a whole 50% of the world that still remains kind of functionally unconnected to the internet. How does infrastructure fit into that conversation? And why is it that we can't just rely on the same mechanisms that connected the first 50% to connect the next 50%?
Well, I think the first issue is that the internet has gone from kind of luxury to quasi-essential tool, right? You know, it is so powerful now that many of us who have access can't imagine an unconnected life, and feel a physical sense of unease when we're separated from our smartphones, but which may not be a good thing necessarily. But the fact is that I describe access to the internet as kind of superpower in that I'm able to find my way across a city I've never been to. I'm able to, figure out how to fix my car. I can learn an entirely new field of knowledge because I have access, and all of that is tremendously empowering. And to the extent that anyone without access is moving further behind just by standing still, because people with access can realize so much more in their lives. So, with that said, now everyone should have access to the internet, which is not to say the internet is an unalloyed good. There are clearly, we live in an age where there's clearly a two-edged sword, and that is something that clearly needs to be managed as infrastructure is introduced. But the genie is not going back in the bottle for the internet. So if we believe that everyone should deserves access to the internet in order to help them self-actualize, then can we just rely on telcos to do it? Can we rely on the incumbent telcos or mobile network operators to build that infrastructure? I think in the heyday of the sort of mobile explosion in the early 2000s, there was a kind of belief that, mobile networks are going everywhere. They're going out throughout Africa. Problem solved. We'll just leave it to the private sector. They have done the job, and it really was a kind of triumph of the the private sector versus slow-moving state-owned incumbents. But the reality of where we are now is that there's a quite a dramatic slowing of growth now in the rollout of networks, and I think the explanation for why that is that we've connected half the world, but it was the easy half. It was the relatively wealthy, relatively densely populated urban areas, and while networks have gone out into rural areas, they've gone out, about as far as they can reasonably go, and be profitable as they are. So we're now in a quandary of, well, how do we go further? You
mean geographically, or?
Yeah, geographically, and also in terms of affordability, I think.
Sure.
How do we make it both more accessible and more affordable? And the answer to date has been, well, we must have universal service funds that will then subsidize the big operators to then build infrastructure and deliver universal access. And that has worked to a degree in that I think it has accelerated the rollout of infrastructure to places that the network operators were going to go to eventually. But I think where we are now is we're at the edge of where they were going to go eventually, which means that now we need a new idea, right? We need, how do we create sustainable access in areas where the populations are more spread out, where the incomes are lower? What's going to solve that problem? Mm-hmm. And I think different people have different answers to that. But the one the answer that seems both plausible and attractive to me is that smaller networks can actually address gaps in access and gaps in affordability in innovative ways, both technologically but also organizationally. And that you don't have to be a big commercial provider. You can be a cooperative, or you can be a community network. You can be a municipal network. There are many ways of solving this, and yet it's difficult to do.
Yeah. So, what are some of the things that make that difficult? I mean, it sounds like if big telecoms aren't likely to get to many of these communities, if we've connected the easy 50% and the other 50% are, increasingly more difficult to reach, and there's an increasing realization that, in fact, big telcos are unlikely to reach them. What's standing in the way then of, for instance, communities taking matters into their own hands? Do big telcos care about what's happening in that last 50%, even though they're not making the effort to get out there?
Yeah, I don't think they do particularly care. I mean, telcos care about their shareholders. That is the reality of certainly of privately held telcos. I think we until not so long ago, we lived in a world where it was impossible to build a telecommunications network of any size unless you had millions of dollars to invest in international connectivity, in national networks, in last mile technologies, in handsets. But there's been a profound change in the sort of the technology of access now that has changed that. I think that the spread of fiber optic infrastructure has created a generic backbone that anyone can access, because fiber optic technology is kind of like the deep water ports of the internet, right? That you can bring an incredible amount of capacity to the end of a fiber optic cable, such that a thin fiber optic cable can not just host a big telco, but can host 100 big telcos and still not be exhausted. So that anyone who can gain access to fiber then is suddenly on a level playing field with the biggest telecommunication operators in the world. And so now then, it begs the question, well, if suddenly you could gain access to fiber, what could you do? And that might be building your own fiber network locally in a community, or it might be using wireless technologies to extend that access to build a local network. And what has changed with wireless technologies is that they've just across the board, all kinds of wireless technologies have become dramatically cheaper. And so, within the purchasing power of, even the poorest communities.
Mm-hmm. So this is part of the story of why infrastructure is so essential to this conversation about connecting the unconnected. Because I think that when we think about access, often we think about certain abstractions around access. We think about rights to information. We think about rights to expression. And we don't actually necessarily think in the day-to-day about the delivery of that access, so how the access actually gets to users. And so could we maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about internet infrastructure? So what are the elements of internet infrastructure that are most important to this conversation?
Sure. In terms of physical infrastructure, you can think of it like the body's circulatory system, right? You have the main arteries that carry blood throughout the body, and those are really the fiber optic infrastructure. Those are the near light speed, almost infinite in capacity in terms of today's usage, cables that carry data around the world. And so undersea cables doing the connection between continents, and then massive terrestrial networks. And that's all happened quite recently. So, in sub-Saharan or on the African continent, there's, over 1 million kilometers of terrestrial fiber most of which has been built in the last 10 years, which I mean,
Wow.
most people are unaware of, right? Because
Yeah.
it's under the ground, or it's up in the air. It's kind of invisible, but I think it's as profound a change in technology as mobile telephony itself. And then once you've got these sort of big arteries, then you need to sort of translate it and get it out, into communities, into the sort of middle and last mile, and certainly in the global south, but I think globally in general, mobile technologies have come to dominate in terms of how to deliver broadband to people, and that involves a range of wireless technologies, from the mobile generations of 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, to technologies we see in every building we go into, like Wi-Fi, and then a range of others. So wireless technologies occupy a range of different kinds of radio technologies across a range of frequencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you were here for our conference the past couple of days, and over those couple of days, we talked a lot about different resources, so infrastructural resources that are especially essential for enabling connectivity for the unconnected. And so one was certainly fiber, which you've mentioned. Mm-hmm. Another is something called spectrum, which many folks tuning in will know what that is, and some won't. And another is masts. This was another towers,
sure.
Yeah, which are kind of related to both. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these different resources interact with one another or don't, and what they're used for in terms of facilitating that connectivity along the last mile.
Sure. So spectrum refers to the range of electromagnetic radiation that is used to transmit information, and that includes television, radio. But when we talk about telecommunications, it typically breaks down into technologies that are either used to create point-to-point connections. So these are kind of microwave technologies that are a bit like fiber in that they create broadband links over line of sight to sort of extend fiber networks, or access networks. And access networks generally fall into two different categories. So one is license exempt technologies, or typically what we refer to as Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi has the virtue of, in the name, license exempt. You don't need to go to the communication regulator to request permission to use it. You can just go and buy the technology and deploy it, and that. The very nature of that has led to a kind of explosion of innovation with that technology in terms of manufacturing and the growth of the potential of the technology, to the extent now we see Wi-Fi embedded in everything from refrigerators to shipping containers to our phones to laptops to everything. And so it's a huge success story in a way of making radio spectrum available in a way that isn't set down by licenses, but is rather determined by the technology itself, which is sort of engineered to play nicely with other technologies like it. And for community networks, it has proven to be an amazingly powerful technology, because it has become so powerful and so cheap that for a few $100s, you can build an access network that actually covers, several hundred people, and much more. So that's very exciting. The other world, though, is the success story that are mobile broadband networks, in this sort of generational 2G, 3G, 4G, but that works very, very differently in terms of spectrum, in that rather than relying on technology being engineered to be polite, to sort of coexist with other devices like it, partly by constraining the power outputs, licensed spectrum, it really just sort of clears the field for a range of spectrum for an operator and gives them exclusive use of that range of spectrum, which means that for an entire country, an operator will get, a range of spectrum that is only theirs to use, which means that they can turn up the power on the radios and reach a much larger area. So typically with Wi-Fi, you can reach maybe 100 to 150 meters maximum with an access point. But with mobile networks, they can reach 10, 15 or more kilometers in radius, which allows
from a
them.
tower.
Yeah, and in combination with
Sure.
with a taller tower that that allows them to do that. So and that allows them to different economics of access.
Right. But still, even despite the greater reach that telcos can have with that kind of technology, they're still not reaching rural areas, and in those areas, sometimes that spectrum isn't actually being used. Is that right?
No, it's completely true.
Yeah.
The current model of making that spectrum available, it's typically made available via auction because the demand for that spectrum has exceeded the availability, and auctions are deemed the sort of best practice these days in terms of making that spectrum available. So mobile broadband is a lucrative business, and that spectrum often is auctioned for millions and millions of dollars. I mean, in the US, billions of dollars. And so in exchange for that, exclusivity is granted, and that exclusivity is granted throughout the country. The downside being that, in rural underserved areas where network operators aren't interested necessarily or don't find a profitable business case in deploying it, they still own the spectrum. So it typically lies fallow. And that's true in the global north and the global south, that in rural areas, spectrum, in spite of the sort of perceived scarcity, in urban markets, there's no scarcity in rural areas.
Right, and the scarcity the dynamic there comes from the fact that if you have interference, right, on your band, right,
Yeah.
that prevents the transfer of data and the transmission of voice calls and things like that.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
With the current mobile technologies,
Yeah.
they need to be interference free.
Yeah, but more of an issue in densely populated areas, obviously, than it is in some of these rural environments where it's not being used.
Yeah, and so it is. I mean, it does beg the question that we do need to solve the problem of rural access, and there is all this unused spectrum.
Yeah.
This is a kind of a problem that is relatively easy to solve,
Sure.
but we need a regulatory framework that enables it.
Yeah, so we will come back to the regulatory framework question in a minute, but since we've been talking about how big telcos have the capacity to buy up spectrum in these auctions that you were mentioning, I think it might be worth kind of reflecting on what the ownership of other kinds of infrastructure looks like right now, because you were mentioning earlier just the revolution in fiber access that has occurred within the last 5 to 10 years, especially in Africa, for instance. But who owns that fiber? So, I've seen a lot of news articles lately about Facebook and Microsoft and Google, for instance, owning significant portions of the new undersea cables that are being laid between continents. And so, who actually controls access to that fiber backbone?
Well, historically, undersea cables have been built by consortia of telcos, basically. So telecommunications companies who want international access, and they form consortia to invest together to build a cable. And most undersea cables, up until a few years ago, fit that profile. What seems to be changing at the moment is that currently, I should say that over 50% of international data traffic on these undersea cables is, generated by a few internet giants from Silicon Valley. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. And, these companies, recognizing that, have now begun to take decisions to build their own infrastructure. So recently, Google announced it was building a cable down the west coast of Africa, the Equiano cable, which may have some astounding amount of capacity, like 300 terabits per second. It's huge, but it's a cable that's wholly owned by Google.
Right.
Facebook have another project for for a cable around Africa called Simba as well. So there is, I think we're beginning to see investment by data companies as opposed to by telcos. Should we be worried about that? It's hard to say. I mean, so the thing perhaps to worry about is the fact that your data increasingly stops traveling over the internet, but travels over private infrastructure. So if I'm in Johannesburg and I access a Gmail account, then you might get to the local cache of Gmail on the public internet, but from then on you're on a private network all the way to potentially to California, which means that Google is operating telecommunications infrastructure, but isn't regulated as a telco, which I don't know. I mean, I think it changes things, but it's hard to see how. And then on the other side, you see, the kind of geopolitical forces shaping internet infrastructure. So a lot of Chinese investment in undersea cable infrastructure as a kind of alternative to Western-built infrastructure, probably related to cybersecurity and surveillance, and having alternative internet routes that can be trusted. So China's Belt and Road strategy is not just about undersea cables. It's an economic strategy, but has led to the investment in something called the Peace Cable, which comes down the east coast of Africa, and they've recently built the cable from Cameroon to Brazil called the Sail Cable. And so those cables are economically controlled by China versus economically controlled by a Silicon Valley company. That is, I think it's going to have subtle but profound effects on internet traffic, but we're at such an early day and we don't really have, that data on traffic flows is not, it's very difficult to sort of surface what those changes are going to be like at the moment.
Yeah, does this have any effect on the forces of centralization or decentralization operating on the internet? Because I think we talk about that not necessarily always in the context of infrastructure, but everything that you've been saying kind of leads me to feel like infrastructure ought to be part of that conversation.
There's no question that there is a sort of centralization or gradual centralization of ownership of infrastructure, and bigger companies are building bigger infrastructure, and to some extent creating vertical markets, right? In terms of being both a physical infrastructure company and a data company. It's as worrying as also the vertical markets created by like an MTN or a Vodacom in terms of selling, mobile networks, but also the kind of value-added services that go on top of it.
Sure. So then, if there's this greater centralization of ownership of this kind of backbone infrastructure for the internet, what hope exists for these kind of smaller enterprises, community networks that are trying to connect, let's say, to the internet independently?
Well, so it depends on what scale we're talking about. So for undersea cables, the real peril is only having one undersea cable coming to your country, which is the case in many countries. For instance, in West Africa, are only served by a single cable, and then you don't get a lot of competitive pressure, and prices at the gateway stay high, and that has an impact on the entire country in terms of the rollout of infrastructure. Countries that are lucky enough to have 2, 3, and 4 undersea cables generally have fairly cheap capacity, and there is enough kind of capacity and competitive forces at work that the prices for international access come down. Then terrestrial infrastructure becomes the next barrier, and often the cost of terrestrial infrastructure, certainly in sub-Saharan African countries, is often higher than the international cost, simply because there's no competitive pressure there to lower costs. And well, you get one of two scenarios. One, you either have the state government, which has seen the strategic value of the internet and is investing in a national asset, but has often borrowed the money and is keen to pay it back as quickly as possible, and thus prices are high on the national backbone network. Or a private operator like MTN or Airtel or Vodafone have built their own private network and are also extracting value. And the problem is, this is infrastructure, and the key to infrastructure, if you think about it like a bridge or a road or a railway, to get the maximum economic benefit out of it, you want the maximum amount of traffic flowing on it. So toll roads are a disincentive to that kind of traffic, and generally, on a railway, we want that railway to be used as much as possible. That's to maximize the kind of economic positive externalities that are going to be realized. And that's intuitive thinking but when we come to internet infrastructure, you don't get that same sort of intuitive thinking, and you still get that kind of like, how can we maximize the revenue we get from this as as an asset. So shifting that thinking is challenging.
Yeah, that's obviously part of this equation, because depending on how communities, for instance, on the peripheries of the internet, need or want to connect, it will have this is an essential part of that conversation. What the costs then are for using that highway, essentially, that's been laid, for that infrastructure that already exists.
And there's a case to be made for governments to set aside some of that infrastructure for public good initiatives like cooperatives and community networks. So if you take a case like Uganda, the government is building out free Wi-Fi in Kampala because they see the public good of the internet. And yet you have a community network up in Gulu, the Bosco, that is delivering Wi-Fi into refugee camps in northeastern in Uganda. And they are crippled by the cost of the backhaul cost of getting their data back down to Kampala. And that network is owned by the government, the NITA backbone. It would be easy for the government to set aside capacity for community networks that in a way that would dramatically empower Bosco and other similar initiatives in the region. So, I mean, I think there needs to be more creative thinking for sort of social purpose use of network backbones.
Yeah. I mean, one policy intervention that you have certainly recommended in the past and continue to do is open telecom data. So could you talk a little bit about what that really calls for and how that's relevant to this conversation about accessing the backbone?
Sure. So as I was saying earlier, I mean, once you can get on fiber,
right,
you are only milliseconds away from the rest of the internet. So instantly you can get access to a fiber backbone. You are suddenly able to deliver a service which is similar to any the best commercial provider. But often it's not obvious where that fiber optic infrastructure is. Often the maps of the fiber are not published. So for instance, where I live in Nova Scotia in Canada at the moment, we have built a cooperative and are in the process of designing a fiber network in rural Nova Scotia. But we cannot get the incumbents to tell us where the fiber networks are and are not. They'll play a game of go fish with you, so right? Because they'll say, tell us where you would like fiber, and we'll tell you if it exists there.
Okay.
But they won't publish a map of that fiber, and the argument being that it sort of somehow affects their commercial competitiveness to that if they reveal that secret of where the fiber networks are. But I would argue that it's a public good, and that we need and because really you want to empower community networks, cooperatives, small ISPs to build networks everywhere, especially in rural areas. And to be able to spot opportunities, you need to know where those deep water ports are. And it seems a very simple ask, but it is less straightforward than you would imagine. And I think the general argument for why not is that it would somehow compromise national security to reveal that information that would make the country vulnerable to, an act of terrorism.
Sure.
And I think
I guess in conflict environments that are already, where tensions are already high, infrastructure can be a target. So I can see.
Well, definitely. I mean, certainly in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there are, malicious interruptions of competitors' fiber infrastructure, but they don't need a map to do that. They know where if you're in the business, you know where the fiber is. It's really for the communities who are not part of the kind of telecommunications industry. They have no idea where that infrastructure is, and so that's the key, I think.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about some of the impediments to smaller enterprises or community networks getting started, in part because of the dominance of big telcos in the space, the ways in which the resources, so the infrastructural resources needed to access the internet are controlled and distributed as well, things like spectrum and fiber. So I'm just wondering if you have any specific examples of more positive stories in this regard. Are there positive examples of spaces where community networks have actually been able to thrive due to some very forward-looking regulatory decisions?
Sure. I mean, I think the best examples is a nonprofit organization in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico called Rhizomatica. And they have established a federation of cooperatives to build their own GSM networks. And what's revolutionary about that is that this is a community network that is using licensed spectrum to deliver access. And so typically, as I said earlier, exclusive licenses preclude anyone else participating in that spectrum. But what happened was the founders of Rhizomatica saw the opportunity of low-cost technologies. So about 10 years ago, there were some pioneering initiatives to produce open source, open hardware GSM technologies like OpenBTS and OpenBSC. And they managed to get an experimental license from the Mexican regulator to build one of these base stations, and it worked. It worked remarkably well, and it was very inexpensive. A typical mobile macro base station may cost $150,000. These were base stations that cost less than $10,000. And on the success of that, they were able to convince the Mexican regulator to actually set aside a certain amount of GSM spectrum specifically for rural GSM use, in particular in indigenous areas in Mexico. And that is a revolutionary idea of saying, it's clearly rural access is different from from urban access, and we need, from a regulatory point of view, to do something different. And certainly that is an idea that deserves to be propagated to many other countries, because that spectrum, there's typically enough spectrum available in most countries to do that kind of thing, but it's a question of will on the part of the regulator to actually set aside some of that spectrum and say, look, we clearly have a problem in terms of delivering the unserved to the unserved in rural areas. This costs us nothing. Right, because typically the amounts of spectrum are small enough that they're not going to be of interest to the large operators. And there's essentially two ways of doing that. One is to actually find some unused spectrum that hasn't been assigned to an operator, and just say, okay, this is social purpose spectrum for rural access, and that's what happened in Mexico. A more exciting idea in some ways, because it offers more flexibility, would be to introduce what is called secondary use of spectrum. And so in this case, this would be using spectrum that has already been assigned to to an operator as the primary user. So, be it sort of Vodacom or MTN or Airtel or similar operators, but in areas where they have no interest in deploying spectrum, creating a mechanism to allow community networks to access that spectrum to deliver services in areas that are below the radar, below the economic radar for the big operators. And that's not really that revolutionary a principle in that secondary use in spectrum regulation has been around for a long time, and it's sort of been upgraded to the 21st century with the introduction of something called TV whitespace technology, which is a reuse of television broadcast spectrum on a secondary basis, governed by a geolocation database that sort of determines where it's okay and where it's not okay to use that spectrum. So, and TV white space technology is great, but it doesn't talk directly to your phone, right? So, applying the same idea of kind of a geolocation database technology that governs the use of the spectrum in these remote areas, but allows the community networks to use LTE technology, means that community networks could be building their own LTE networks, serving the unserved in ways that are very, very affordable. Because all of these radio technologies now have come down so dramatically in price that even LTE networks are a few $1,000s to build a single node for.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about how much this actually costs. And then I have a related question about the regulatory environment for community networks. But we've mentioned a few price tags for different things. You mentioned the base station that's come down tremendously in price to one that could be built for $10,000, right? So what are we talking about in terms of affordability now for some of this technology that community networks would need, to deploy a local network?
So certainly, I mean, Wi-Fi technologies are ridiculously cheap. You can buy a reasonably powerful Wi-Fi access point for $100, and an outdoor one that can be used for a community network, and by deploying 10 of them for $1,000, you can cover quite a substantial area of a community. The downside is that it's Wi-Fi only, so the range is you've got to stay in range, and it doesn't offer the kind of instantly offer like voice calling and that kind of thing that you would get with a mobile network, but tremendously powerful for broadband. So that kind of thing is very, very easy to do, and the technology has become so much easier. So 10 years ago it was quite complicated to actually configure a Wi-Fi network. You had to really get into the weeds in terms of configuring all the the network, and
you had to be a telecoms engineer, basically.
Well, or you had to have some either engineering skills or appetite to learn. And now, I mean, the software and hardware is so easy to use and set up that many of those skills, you still need some of them, but they're pretty modest. The barrier is fairly low. And so you get cases, for instance, in Nova Scotia, on the other side of the province from where I live, there's a small community of about 500 people. And, they were frustrated with the not being served by the incumbents, by Bell, and decided to build their own Wi-Fi network, and bought low-cost equipment from a company called Ubiquiti, and now serve I think about 250 or 300 clients in the community. And they started out charging about $50, I think, and they had a problem because they discovered they were making too much money, so they had to drop the price to about $30 a month for their community.
It's the kind of problem I like to hear about.
And it is remarkable, and the interesting thing is the cooperative they built there was so successful for them in terms of solving that problem. They've now taken that to looking at other problems. So they don't have a doctor in Lawrencetown, and they're extending the cooperative to actually to health services and using it to pool their funds to bring medical services to where they are. So it's this is something you wouldn't find with a commercial service. Is the sense of empowerment that you get from being able to build an entire telecommunications network yourself. Inspires, I think, the ability to solve other problems. And I know, you have many stories to share in that regard in terms of your conversations with Chris Conder from Barn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's actually maybe a little bit less about the telecommunications network itself. It's not really about connecting to the internet necessarily. It's actually about community connectivity and in other ways, much more nuanced kind of capacity building that occurs on the ground in these communities where it's about the technology, but it's actually really more about interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, and in some ways, the technology, in this context, is almost just simply a vehicle for the renaissance of cooperatives in a way, and the sort of re-recognition of non-commercial ways of building economies.
Yeah, and just investment in kind of in the self and in the community. Maybe hasn't happened for a while, and it's the collaboration around the network that actually instigates some kind of rejuvenation in the local area, which is it's really exciting and inspiring, but it's very much about the local community itself, not so much about the tech.
Yeah. And I think, another feature though is that it actually keeps the investment local, so that money goes into the local infrastructure, into local pockets, as opposed to, as amazing as mobile networks are, that the money flows, especially for poor rural communities, the money is flowing out of the community into the head offices of those telcos, whether they're in the capital cities or internationally. And what I think particularly appeals about community networks is that they sort of stem that flow and see it reinvested.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really an investment in the local community, the skills, and also just the energy that goes into creating something.
Yeah,
it actually has a lot of knock-on effects. It winds up creating quite a lot of other things and experiences. I think that when we talk about policy in general around telecommunications, there's kind of a narrative, a long-standing narrative that regulation is reserved for big telcos, right? And actually, regulation has kind of evolved to address big telcos and in conversation with big telcos. But actually, this whole conversation that we've been having has kind of been pointing to the fact that there's kind of space for regulation to step in maybe here to help facilitate smaller enterprises and community initiatives around internet connectivity. So what's happening there? Why this transition? Why are we talking about regulation now kind of for small organizations?
Largely because it's possible right now. So the changes in technology have put the power to build a network within reach of both of small organizations, but also small resources. So now that ability to build a network is within the scope of any small committed group of individuals. And now that exists, we begin to bump up against a regulatory framework that is designed for multinational corporations.
Right.
So often, the administrative overhead of trying to get a license to be a network operator, or the fees that are required, or the compliance in terms of know your customer regulations or record retention, they have all been designed for for big multi-million-dollar companies. And the same with Spectrum, right? Spectrum is auctioned for millions of dollars at the moment, which creates this incredible barrier to market entry. It's just like, it's simply out of the question, for a small operator to be a mobile operator, given the prices that are paid, which which sort of locks out all of this potential that now exists to change the way networks are built. So there's an opportunity for regulators to adapt regulation to not in any way threaten the big operators. This is in no way a kind of zero-sum game. This is purely additive for smaller operators and with alternative business models and organizational forms to then begin to serve areas that weren't really a lot of interest to the big telcos in the first place, and if successful, are going to generate more traffic that will go on the big telcos networks anyway. So it's not it's absolutely not a kind of a threat to the big operators. It's actually a way of expanding the market.
Yeah, it's an interesting space for opportunity, I think, because of the fact that it does require some innovation, actually, in terms of what regulation can and should do. And so what are some of the recommendations that you think should be made in this space? I mean, that's kind of is the premise, I guess, of this series we're doing on rights to the network. When it comes to making regulation and making regulators more dynamic and more responsive to different contexts, like the difference between, for instance, an urban environment and a rural environment, the difference between a big telco and a small up-and-coming community network. How can regulation better adapt to that? And the reason that we really need to ask this question now and also over and over again is because regulation tends to become kind of cookie cutter. It tends to become one size fits all, even if that wasn't the original intention. And right now, the one size is big. It fits big telcos. And so how do we make it more dynamic and adaptable?
Well, I think, as William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. There are examples of really good practice that can enable community networks around the world. So one of the biggest tools that a regulator can use is simply forbearance. So they can simply say, we don't require you to report on this. So for instance, if you want to be an internet service provider in Canada or the US, you can just start being one, right? You put up your shingle, your Wi-Fi access point, and
that was my plan for the weekend.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's very easy to get into the market. And as a result, the US has hundreds, if not thousands, of small kind of mom and pop ISPs. Which is great. So, below a certain threshold of income, the regulator can say, well, just carry on. This is not actually going to, have, huge fallout if you succeed or fail, unless you grow very large, in which case, beyond that threshold, we will, ask you for more traditional kind of compliance with the rules. So that's step one. Step two is is financing. So right now, the universal service funds strategies tend to be focused on the incumbents, right? So it's money that's taxed from the network operators, and they often feel that it should come back to them to roll out rural infrastructure, and that clearly isn't working that well. It's not going to, it has worked to a degree, but it's not going to deliver all that we need to connect everyone. So opening up those universal service funds to community networks, to cooperatives, creating mechanisms that don't just sort of, work if you're a commercial operator, that respect, alternative organizational forms like cooperatives, or NGOs, or any other kinds of kind of commons-based organizations. And so, recognizing their value and recognizing the value of the small operator. And you know, there are critiques that have been leveled at community networks for being small are kind of misplaced, I think, because you know, the idea is not to have a community network grow to be a global operator, but to, you know, allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, in the sense that, you know, the next big thing is a lot of small things, and you know, we can begin to fill the gaps in access in rural areas by, you know, hundreds of thousands of small networks. So funding them, so you know, reducing the administrative burden and fees associated with them if you're a small network operator, providing funding mechanisms, and then two things in terms of access to the network. One is access to the fiber backhaul, and the other is access to spectrum. Access to fiber, you know, we need more transparency. We need to be able to see where the infrastructure is, and we need to be able to access it, you know, at a reasonable price. And you know, that you know, at the very minimum level means open access policies that ensure free fair pricing for everybody, but perhaps also incentives for or you know, reduced prices for nonprofit networks delivering access into unserved areas. And then on the side of spectrum, you know, we need a strategy to go beyond Wi-Fi and to allow community networks to access spectrum for mobile broadband services. So that means, you know, either having set aside some spectrum for unserved or underserved, or you know, rural areas, or creating these kind of secondary use mechanisms that allow use of spectrum in areas where the incumbents aren't economically driven to. And then I mean, the other piece of that is getting regulators to sort of double down on the success of Wi-Fi. So right now, you know, the regulator in the US is expanding the range of Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi currently operates in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. The FCC is looking at expanding the 5 gigahertz range on into the 6 gigahertz range, which would, you know, dramatically increase the potential to use Wi-Fi for broadband and increase opportunities for community networks to deliver access.
Just because it creates more space, essentially, there can be more.
Yeah, so it increases the potential. Well, it does two things. One is it increases the potential for coexistence, and it actually increases the amount of throughput that you can create with links, because you can use, you know, a larger frequency.
Sure. I think maybe one thing that might be worth mentioning about about sort of sending funds back to big telcos in order for them to reach underserved communities in relation to universal service funds and those kinds of incentive schemes is that when those funds get allocated toward, for instance, rural broadband or rural connectivity, sometimes even when a telco can reach that community through these incentive schemes, maintaining the network there can be challenging, and there aren't long-term incentives for the big telco to continue to restore and maintain the infrastructure that they have laid in order to connect that community, whereas local communities, because they are based locally and because they are invested in themselves and their neighbors, often have greater capacity to actually maintain the infrastructure if they own and manage it themselves. So you don't get that same kind of deterioration and lag that can occur over time. And I think in a future episode of this Rights to the Network series, we are going to talk a little bit more about universal service funds and taxation and how those issues factor into connecting the unconnected a little bit more. So stay tuned for that if you're kind of thinking, I'd like to know more about that.
Well, I can give you an example from
great.
a country in Southern Africa where the Universal Service Fund funded the build out of 103 base stations.
Wow.
So, you know, funded, you know, the incumbents to build out 103 base stations. And of those 103 base stations, only 77 are non-functional. So like funding the
good example of this.
Funding the capital
exactly.
the capital costs of the network is not enough in many cases, because big network towers require diesel generators as backup. Diesel's expensive. The travel to these remote areas to do the maintenance to keep them going is expensive, and often the incomes that these big operators need are simply, they don't generate enough income to justify keeping the towers on, and with the result that operators who are accountable to their shareholders can't make the business case to say we need to continue delivering services in this area.
Yeah, but this can be really problematic when it comes to reporting, for instance, coverage and connectivity, because you could say, well, actually, technically, this area is covered because it's got a tower. But if the tower isn't operational, or if in fact it's not providing connectivity, even though the infrastructure is there, then in fact people on the ground don't have connectivity, and so that can really distort our understanding of who's connected and who's not connected, and also the effectiveness of big telcos to reach those communities.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that. That's a piece where another issue of transparency, of actually having the locations of towers being a matter of public record, because then you could actually interrogate that the coverage claims from operators, and actually ground truth the reality of those claims, because there are incentives for mobile network operators to describe the size of their network in ways that may exaggerate. So for instance, if you're negotiating roaming agreements, the size of your network actually determines what kind of roaming agreement you can negotiate with another operator. So naturally, you want your network to be as big as possible. You may have coverage obligations from the regulator, and so if you are again, an incentive to state as big a number as possible in terms of your network coverage. So having some kind of public check and balance is essential, and the key to doing that is actually knowing where the towers are. And knowing where the towers are, has other interesting benefits. So in Canada's one of a small number of countries where the regulator actually publishes the location of every single tower in the country, every radio, every antenna. It's amazingly detailed. And researchers at Citizen Lab, an NGO at the University of Toronto, were able to take that data and use it to test for stingrays, which are these IMSI catchers, which are fake base stations used for surveillance. And so by having a comprehensive list of where the real base stations were, they were actually able to go and look for these fake base stations. So an unintended benefit of that transparency.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think this is a good time to check and see if we have any questions that have come in, and then and if not, I've always got a few more, but let's see what we've got here in our chat window. If you do have questions for Steve about access to infrastructure issues, please do send them in through the chat or using the hashtag on Twitter, #GlobalMediaQ. That's the letter Q. And especially also, I see some folks have sent in suggestions of resources related to infrastructure and access to infrastructure, and that's really great. So if you are an expert on this issue, or you've done some reading on it and you've got some suggestions, that's great, because we are collating input for this policy recommendation at IGF. So that's super helpful. We've got some fans of TV Whitespace here. That's always good. Some recommendations of readings. So someone's asking if you have any resources that you would recommend people reference if they're interested in understanding some of the policy debates around telecoms infrastructure in particular. And I'm going to put a plug in for the resource that you and Carlos Rey Moreno recently put together. So I'll let you talk about it. But
sure. My colleague Carlos Rey Moreno and I and Mike Jensen wrote a paper for ISOC looking at innovations in the regulation of spectrum, specifically from the point of view of how do we make space for community networks and small scale operators. And so, I mean, spectrum is a complex topic in that you have to be kind of part engineer, part lawyer, part economist to understand it. And so we've written it in as accessible a manner as possible, but mostly looking at good practice around the world where regulators are doing really interesting things, like in Mexico, like in the US and elsewhere, and saying, here's something that you can look at as a way to sort of make space in your world for community networks. And I think the best thing often is to simply join a community. So the Dynamic Coalition for Community Networks, which we can provide a link to, is a mailing list where you can simply ask questions about community networks, and also we're about to launch an online community for exactly for people who are building community networks and have questions about technology, questions about regulation, questions about sustainability. We want to create a kind of a space where we can share our knowledge and learn from good examples and support each other. So that we'll provide a link to that in the description as well.
Yeah, if you're interested in joining that, that's a really good space to have conversations about this. And someone actually pointed out an infrastructure issue that we didn't really touch on, which is electricity, power for these networks.
Indeed.
There are obviously a few things that could be said about that, but obviously internet infrastructure needs to be powered in some way. And actually a lot of the communities we're talking about that exist on the peripheries of connectivity don't just struggle with internet connectivity. They also don't necessarily have connectivity to an electricity grid. So is there anything you'd like to say about that as an infrastructural issue as well in this conversation?
Well, I'd say, innovations in, solar technology is a natural companion to these new low-cost technologies. So a lot of the sort of, low-cost base stations are also low power consumption and can be run completely on solar technology. So that's really powerful. And the combining solar and low-cost wireless networks is can actually increase their sustainability as well. When Zenzaleni, which is a community network in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, first launched, they actually made most of their revenue from selling charging, as opposed to from any revenue from the network itself. So they are, kind of two great tastes that go great together. I'd say we probably need better strategies for the integration of kind of microgrid technologies and community networks in regions where the power grid is weak or non-existent.
Yeah, but you're right. These two issues really do go hand in hand. And actually the cost of all the tech across the board, including technology to enable electricity supply, has come down a lot over time. So that's something that has helped enable communities take the electricity matter into their own hands as well. And then we also had a question here about how do you convince operators? This is a negotiation question. How can you go about convincing operators to actually share their spectrum or to implement some of those policy recommendations that we were discussing before?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is relatively new ground. I think, you could introduce a quid pro quo where by allowing if operators allow access to their spectrum in rural areas, that they can actually get a reduction in fees and in their universal service contribution. And this is very similar to a strategy that Ofcom in the UK have announced for their new spectrum licenses, in that operators can receive a rebate on the fee that they paid for spectrum based on the number of base stations that they build out into rural areas. So that's a good idea. But I think it would be good to take it even further than that and say, look, it doesn't have to be you. You can get that rebate. You just have to allow somebody else to do it. And
big telcos seem very unwilling to want to do this, right? Like they don't want to relinquish their market dominance in a way. Is that a misperception, or
no? I mean, no, of course. I mean,
because even when you say, "Come on, you're not going to connect those 500 people out there in the middle of rural America," and they say, "Well, we might."
Yeah, and also, there is the sort of, that very low risk that, that one of these tiny networks may grow up to be, a giant. And ultimately, that's what you want, right?
Yeah.
You want, an ecosystem where, you get young networks growing up into being bigger networks, and the kind of innovation that happens from, small, that you can get from small organizations that you can't get from big companies. So I mean, the ecosystem is broken at the moment because we have a system that only allows monoliths, and that just kills innovation.
Yeah, you were describing this as a forest at one point, and I really liked that imagery, right? That we've only got these big, giant, oak trees or something growing.
I mean, I think as regulators need to think like a forest steward, right? That you want an ecosystem of different kinds of growth that sustain each other, that feed each other, right? That create a kind of symbiotic, ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you get from community networks. Community networks rely on big networks for access and generate more traffic for them ultimately.
Yeah.
So you're sort of resetting that idea of small networks being a threat to them actually creating a healthier, busier ecosystem of access.
Yeah. So another question that we've gotten is how to calculate the economic value of spectrum specifically is the question, but I think this could really apply to any of the infrastructure that we've talked about. How do you actually calculate the value of what this infrastructure should be worth if you want to distribute it at cost, right? If we're not including these big markups the telcos can pay.
For spectrum, I mean, how much is spectrum worth? I mean, spectrum is free. It's all around us, and we create the
we forget that easily because it's become so commoditized. So
and in fact, big operators, start to wonder why are we giving Wi-Fi away for free if we're paying millions of dollars for our license spectrum? Because more traffic is actually carried, internet traffic is carried over Wi-Fi than is carried over a mobile network.
Sure.
And it becomes a kind of distorted thinking. But you have to have a mechanism for balancing the fact that if MTN has paid $65 million for a spectrum license, you have to have a rationale for why you should give a community network free access to that spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think the secondary use argument of delivering access into unserved areas, in areas that are of no interest to the large operators, that are kind of below the economic radar of them, in exchange for a kind of rebate from the universal service funds or some other kind. I mean, the regulator has many ways that they could relax fees for the big operators in order to allow that to happen. I don't know. I find that idea fairly convincing.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, some operators we've talked to, they're beginning to see the possibilities of this. I mean, as a kind of good news story that doesn't affect them economically in any way. So, the downside is it hasn't happened yet. So, except with the exception of Mexico, I mean, we haven't had really a breakthrough yet. At least, especially for LTE networks.
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of imagining something that doesn't exist, which is always a challenge. And also, I mean, governments and regulators are slow-moving beasts is the other thing, in a world in which, this is actually a very fast-moving issue. And the gap between the connected and unconnected only gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And so this is really the right time to be having this conversation. But it also means that it can't just be a conversation. Some kind of innovation has to occur here simultaneously.
Well, and this is where, in talking to regulators, we are trying to convince them that they are the heroes of the access revolution, right?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Never mind Google Loon and drones and satellites, regulators on their own have the power to transform rural access simply by creating an enabling environment and, stepping out of the way to allow small innovative organizations to deploy infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And so recasting the regulator from, a harried bureaucrat into, access superhero, I think is part of that, that story.
That. Yeah. No, I like that imagery a lot. Yeah. Definitely. And so we have one, I think we'll make this the last question from our internet audience, but so we've got another question, which is, so in other words, if the degree of internet dependence continues to sharply increase and extend to daily objects and services, so I'm imagining that's kind of the Internet of Things conversation, could we assist in a shift in the global policy of access?
That's quite a complex question. To some degree, I find the Internet of Things to be a bit of a distraction from access, which for me is really important to be people-centered. And there's a lot of talk in South Africa about the fourth industrial revolution and how, it's going to be a connected everything that's going to enable smart cities and smart infrastructure, some of which may be true. But it is a focus on things as opposed to people. And while I recognize the importance of IoT and its potential, it feels almost, as my colleague Peter Bloom says, that we care more about connecting refrigerators than we care about connecting people. And that seems to be that's sort of worrisome. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question, but I feel that I think
you have. It's got a positive response. So
any shift away from a kind of people-centered solution to focus on access is worries me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think there's over-technologization of this conversation about connectivity as well. Like, we really rely on the tech, and then the Internet of Things narrative, it even further removes it from the human dimensions of connectivity that are actually incredibly important to this conversation about connecting the unconnected. We literally just start talking about objects as opposed to people.
And a lot of that, we see that a lot of that narrative in 5G discussions of the kind of next generation technology. And I feel like the network operators have kind of missed the plot, with this new generation, and that 2G, 3G, and 4G technologies have done amazing things in bringing both voice and broadband into areas unserved. But 5G doesn't seem to bring that same potential, in that it's largely focused on decreasing latency, which is a need for a very small niche of the market. Massive IoT, which is as yet kind of unrealized, and super fast broadband, which is focused on urban centers. So the promise of 5G to actually connect the unserved, there's no plot there. Right. There's no plan, and I feel like the mobile network operators and the technology manufacturers have totally missed the plot. They've given us a Porsche when we wanted the Volkswagen Beetle, and
it's still fundamentally an infrastructure question. You need infrastructure for 5G too.
Also true, sure.
So if it's posited as a solution for connecting the unconnected, it's still very dependent on infrastructure, so the materiality of connectivity, which is something that I think we often lose in this conversation about 5G. And it is somewhat alarming that the future of the internet is kind of posited as the Internet of Things, as opposed to the Internet of People, when 50% of the world essentially still isn't connected, and those are people that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's a complete distortion of priorities, and which is why I feel like I feel like the network operators have missed the plot with this sort of generation of technology, and but there's a massive marketing narrative to move kind of decision makers into needing to do something about that. And we saw that the kind of war of words between the US and China around 5G technologies, and the concern that somehow there is going to lose the race to 5G. I mean, for me, these are hype narratives that have very little basis in reality.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. Is that the note that we want to end this seminar on? Do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to end on? Anything that we didn't cover that you feel you'd like to say?
I would say, I mean, the only thing I would say is that the actual experience of building a community network is such, an empowering thing. Even if it's a tiny network, even if it's only one access point that you build and operate, but the experience of working with others to build your own infrastructure is something I would recommend to anyone, whether you live in New York City or in a remote part of Chad. It is within the power of anyone to embrace this technology and gain access to it, and the transformative effects go well beyond the technology and access. It is the power of communities manifesting things for themselves, which is transformational in so many ways.
That's a great place to close. So everybody get out there and start a community network or join one. Either way. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining me for this seminar. This is great.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's super cool.
Absolutely. And we will be putting some links in the description of this YouTube video, which will be available after the broadcast, so you can watch it and share it with other people. And if you do have resources or recommendations of other topics, issues, literature around access to infrastructure that you'd like to contribute to our ongoing conversation for the Dynamic Coalition, please also feel free to comment on the YouTube video or to message us on Twitter, and we will collect it there. So thank you all so much for joining us, and see you probably next month for another installment of this Rights to the Network series.
Thank you very much.